Marcus Island, First Combat. The Hellcat steps into the war. August 31st, 1943. Western Pacific, aboard USS Yorktown, CFA-10, Task Force 15. The flight deck is a living machine in the dark. Boots thud on steel. Deck crewmen crouch low under the spinning prop wash, and the smell is all gasoline, hot oil, and salt air, sharp enough to sting the back of the throat. Red-lensed flashlights flicker like embers as the first fighters are pushed into position. And in the wavering light, the new airplane looks almost too big to be a carrier fighter, broad-shouldered and blunt-nosed. A Grumman F6F-3 Hellcat, with its wings folded like a clenched fist. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Commander James Jimmy Flatley sits forward against the harness, gloved hand tight on the throttle, listening to the Pratt & Whitney radial rumble settle into a deep, confident beat as the deck vibrates beneath him. He can't see Marcus Island yet, just the black horizon and the pale ghost of spray, but he can feel the ship's speed, the wind over the bow, the whole carrier leaning into launch as if the sea itself is about to throw them. Around him, men shout and signal in practice choreography. Chocks kicked away, a final pat on the fuselage, the deck officer's arm slicing forward. Then the catapult fires and the Hellcat lunges, the world snapping from darkness to roaring wind, the bow dropping away, and the ocean briefly filling the windscreen like a trap. For a heartbeat, you can imagine how it must look from the other side. Japanese lookouts on Marcus Island, hearing the distant growl growing louder and louder, expecting the same American fighters they've learned to turn with and outclimb, expecting the enemy to play the old game. But this airplane is different, and the men flying it know they're carrying more than bombs and bullets. They're carrying a promise made in blood back at Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal. A promise that the US Navy will stop feeding lightly built fighters into a sky ruled by zeros. The Hellcat's first combat comes here, on this raid from Yorktown, with Fighting Squadron 5 taking the type into action for the first time. And every pilot on deck understands the unspoken stakes. If the new fighter fails, the fleet keeps paying in funerals. If it holds, the balance of the air war begins to tilt. Flatley climbs into the thinning grey before dawn, forming up on the strike as the carrier wakes fully behind him, more aircraft lifting off, engines stacking into a rolling thunder. And as the group turns toward Marcus, the radios crackle with clipped call signs and bearings, each word short because there's no spare breath at 140 knots. Somewhere ahead, flak will reach up like black fists. Somewhere ahead, Japanese aircraft may rise to meet them, confident in the stories they tell themselves about American machines being heavy, fragile, too easy to burn. In the Hellcat's cockpit, there's no room for pride. Only the tight pressure of the harness, the steady shake of the engine, and the cold knowledge that the first real test of any fighter is not what it can do on paper, but whether it brings you home when the sky turns violent. When Yorktown's fighters turn back from Marcus Island, the ocean rises to meet them in a flat, endless glare, and the carrier appears like a moving city, wake foaming, deck alive with men and signal paddles. Yet the landing is never routine. Flatley comes in low, tail hooked down, engine rumbling, the deck pitching just enough to make your palms sweat. And when the hook bites the wire, the Hellcat jerks to a stop with a violence that would have snapped lighter airframes, then sits there, blunt and stubborn, as if it refuses to be impressed by anything. In the ready room, sweat-soaked pilots peel off parachute harnesses and talk with the sharp, clipped intensity of men who know that opinions become procedures. What worked, what didn't, what the enemy did, what the airplane did when it mattered. And the Hellcat's first verdict is not romance but practicality. It gets off the deck clean, it carries weight without feeling clumsy, it absorbs punishment, and when you push the nose down, it gathers speed like it's falling into a bottomless well. That's the first quiet revolution, because so much of the early Pacific Air War has been a cruel physics lesson. Wildcats too slow to run, too light to take hits, pilots taught to survive by teamwork and luck, And now there's an aircraft that lets a Navy pilot choose the terms more often than he's used to. The next day, on September 1st, 1943, that practicality turns into something the fleet can count. Hellcats flying from Yorktown's group meet a distant, lumbering shape over the water, a Japanese Kawanishi H-8K, Emily flying boat big as a barn, bristling with guns. And the new fighter does what the new fighter was built to do. It closes with speed, shrugs off the chaos of defensive fire, and tears the big aircraft apart, a first kill that spreads through the ship like caffeine because it's proof the Hellcat isn't just a showroom promise. The Japanese, for their part, have their own stories and habits by now. Years of fighting Americans who, in their eyes, bring sturdy but unsophisticated machines to the sky, planes that can't dance the way a Zero can. In cockpits and briefing rooms, it's easy to dismiss a bulky new Grumman as just a larger Wildcat, to assume weight equals clumsiness, to assume the old trick still works. Bait the American into a turning fight. Watch him bleed energy, then cut inside and finish it. But the Hellcat's danger is that it doesn't need to dance if it can dictate the music. It dives faster. It keeps its structure when the airframe is stressed. It offers the pilot something Japanese carrier aviation prizes, but has begun to lose in the grinding war: survivability. In the weeks that follow, the Hellcat's reputation grows not in newspapers, but in the small, brutal arithmetic of squadron boards. Who comes back? How many holes in the wings? Which tactics keep men alive? The word spreads. Don't try to outturn a Zero at low speed. Don't get greedy. Hit hard from above. Keep your speed. Roll away. Climb back into the sun. And that doctrine feels almost like a moral choice, because it's a refusal to play the enemy's game. You can sense the shift even in the way pilots speak. Less fatalism, more method. By November, as the fleet fights around places like Tarawa and strikes toward Rabaul, Hellcats are no longer curiosities. They are becoming the default face of American carrier air power, the machine that lets newer pilots live long enough to become experienced pilots. And that is the kind of advantage that compounds silently until one day the enemy looks up and realizes the sky has changed. November 11th, 1943. Over Rabaul, New Britain. The sky above the harbour is a harsh, bright blue that makes every black puff of flak look like ink thrown against glass. And Lieutenant J.G. Edward Eddie Murphy grips his Hellcat stick as the aircraft shudders through turbulence and concussion. Below him, the Japanese anchorage is a steel-grey knot of ships and smoke. And ahead, American dive bombers are already tipping into their runs, wings flashing in the sun like knives. In his headset, the radio is a braid of clipped call signs and urgent bearings, the kind of talk that never sounds heroic, only necessary, because the moment the bombers commit, the fighters become the thin skin between them and the enemy's rage. Then the call comes. Bandits, hi, 2 o'clock, zeros. Murphy's eyes snap upward, and there they are, small and pale against the sun, dropping fast with the confidence of men who have spent years turning American mistakes into kills. You can almost feel the attitude through the canopy, the assumption that the big Grumman below will lumber, will overreact, will try to turn, will bleed speed, and then die. 1-0 peels off and comes straight in, nose down, tracing a graceful arc that would have been fatal against earlier Wildcats. Murphy resists the ancient instinct to yank hard into a tight turn, and instead does what the Hellcat and its training are teaching him to do. He unloads the wings, pushes the nose down, and lets speed build, the engine's roar deepening as the airframe feels like it's locking into its element. The Zero flashes past, too fast to count rivets, and Murphy rolls hard, not a flat turn, a rolling, diving maneuver that keeps energy, then pulls up just enough to keep the enemy in view. The Japanese pilot tries to tighten the circle, to force the classic knife fight where the Zero's lightness used to be destiny, but the Hellcat doesn't chase the circle. It climbs out, then drops back in with altitude like money in the bank. For the first time, Murphy sees what veterans have been telling the new guys in ready rooms and on smoke breaks. The Hellcat isn't a miracle, it's a system. Weight, power, armor, self-sealing tanks, a rugged airframe, and tactics designed to keep pilots alive long enough to learn. He dives again, the gun sight ring settling, and when he squeezes the trigger, the 6.50 caliber Browning's hammer with a steady mechanical certainty, the recoil vibrating through the cockpit. Tracers stitch across the Zero's path and the enemy aircraft jolts, a sudden flicker of debris, then a dark ribbon of smoke. The Zero tries to roll away, but the Hellcat's speed keeps pressure on, and Murphy can hear his own breathing loud inside the mask as the Japanese fighter drops toward the haze over the harbor. Around him, the fight multiplies. Hellcats cutting in from above, Zeros snapping into turns, flak bursting, bombers pushing through. And what's terrifying is how quickly you can lose track of who is hunting whom. But what's new, what's different, is the way the Hellcats keep coming back together, regaining altitude, choosing when to re-enter, refusing to stay trapped in the slow, deadly dance the Japanese want. Later, when Murphy lands back on the carrier and climbs out with his legs shaking, he sees the proof written in metal. Holes punched clean through wings that still held, shredded cowlings around engines that still brought men home, aircraft that look abused, but not defeated. In the ready room, pilots speak in short bursts. He tried to drag me low. Don't follow. Hit and climb. He couldn't catch me in the dive. And somewhere in those sentences is the answer to the mockery that still circulates in Japanese cockpits. The Hellcat's heaviness isn't a flaw when it buys you speed, structure, and survival in the messy reality of fleet combat. Out over Rabaul, the Zero can still kill, still bite, still surprise. But it can no longer rely on Americans volunteering to die in a turning circle. And that change, more than any single shootdown, is the beginning of the end. February 17th, 1944, over Truk Lagoon, Caroline Islands. The morning sun turns the water into a sheet of blinding silver, but the lagoon below is already bruised with smoke, black columns climbing from ships caught in their anchorages, oil spreading in dark slicks that glitter at the edges, and flak blooming in ragged bursts that look almost lazy until you hear the sharp cracks reverberate through your ribs. Lieutenant Eddie Murphy is back in the air again, this time in a sky that feels crowded with motion, Avengers droning low, Helldivers stacking up for dives, and Hellcats weaving above them like shepherd dogs, always scanning, always counting the angles where a Japanese fighter might appear. In his headset, the controller's voice is calm and relentless, radar-guided vectors feeding him the war in numbers, bearing, range, altitude, until the threat becomes real. Dots growing into aircraft, a handful of Zeros and other fighters climbing hard from somewhere inland, late to the party, trying to claw altitude back from an enemy that owns the high ground by default. Murphy sees one Japanese pilot commit to the old belief anyway, nose up, wings rocking as he tries to lure a Hellcat into a slow turn. Even from a distance you can read the intent, the same geometry that once trapped Wildcats over Guadalcanal. But the Hellcat driver doesn't bite. He slashes through with speed, a short burst, then climbs away as if pulled by a winch, leaving the Zero turning in air that suddenly feels empty. That is what shocks the Japanese now. Not that the Americans are brave, but that they are disciplined. The Hellcats aren't chasing glory. They're protecting strike aircraft, preserving energy, refusing to trade altitude for ego. Down low, a Japanese fighter makes a desperate run at an Avenger, tracers reaching out like fingers, and Murphy shoves his nose down, the Hellcat accelerating so quickly the cockpit noise changes pitch. He feels the airframe hold together under the strain, feels the armor and mass working in his favor instead of against him. And when he squeezes the trigger, the 6.5s answer with a brutal steadiness that doesn't care about maneuver poetry. The Japanese fighter jolts, flickers, and drops toward the lagoon, and Murphy's immediate reaction isn't triumph, it's calculation. Because the sky is still full of threats, and the only way you survive carrier combat is to keep thinking faster than fear. As he climbs back up, he catches a glimpse of something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Japanese pilots breaking off early, not pressing the attack to the bitter end, not because they lack courage, but because the math has turned against them. Every lost pilot now is a loss that can't be repaired in months. The men coming up behind them are younger, less trained, less seasoned in formation fighting, and you can feel that difference in the way their aircraft enter the fight. Less coordinated, more individual, more hopeful than effective. The Hellcat doesn't need the enemy to be weak. It only needs the enemy to be human, to make one mistake, to lose speed, to turn once too tightly, and then the Grumman's speed and firepower punish the error like a law of nature. When Murphy lands later, deck pitching, hook slamming a wire, he looks back at his airplane and notices how ordinary its brutality has become. Chipped paint, soot stains, the faint smell of cordite trapped in the cowling, and yet it's still ready to go again. He thinks about the Japanese pilots he just fought, men who were once the elite of carrier aviation, and he realizes what mockery really means in wartime. It's the last shield you carry when your old advantages are slipping away. Over truck, with ships burning in the lagoon and the American strike machine rolling forward without pause, that shield is starting to crack, and everyone in the sky can feel it. June 15th, 1944. Philippine Sea, east of the Marianas. The deck of USS Essex CV-9 trembles under a steady wind as Marines hit the beaches of Saipan far beyond the horizon, and the carrier's world narrows to a routine so repetitive it becomes sacred. Dawn launch, combat air patrol, refuel, rearm, climb back into the sun, scan, descend, land, repeat. An industrial rhythm powered by gasoline, radio discipline, and men who have learned that boredom is just the pause before violence. Lieutenant J.G. Eddie Murphy sits in his Hellcat at the edge of the deck and watches the blue morning widen, hearing the flight deck officers whistle, the clatter of chocks, the barked hand signals. His aircraft is no longer new, it's familiar in the way a reliable tool becomes part of your body, and that familiarity is itself a weapon, because the Americans have been grinding experience into procedure for months, while the enemy bleeds experience out faster than it can be replaced. Up in the air, Murphy joins the CAP, and the sky turns into geometry. Sections spread out, altitudes stacked, radios tight and disciplined, and somewhere below them an invisible net is being cast. Shipboard radar sweeping the space, controllers vectoring fighters like chess pieces, telling you where to be before you can even see the threat. It feels unfair almost the way the fleet now fights. Not individual duels, but a system. Radar, radios, disciplined formations, and an airplane built to survive the moment you make a mistake. In the ready room, pilots talk about the enemy with a tone that's changed since 1942. They respect Japanese courage, respect the Zero's turn, but they also talk about Japanese attacks in 1944 as if something is off, less cohesion, more single aircraft lunges, fewer coordinated tactics, and they know why, even if they don't say it aloud. Japan's carrier pilot pipeline is drying up, training time cut, fuel scarce, veterans dead, replacements brave but thin. Across the sea, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet is moving too, and in its carrier ready rooms, the atmosphere is different, not careless, not ignorant, but strained. Japanese aircrews joke the way warriors joke when they need the sound of confidence. The Americans fly fat Grummans, heavy fighters that can't possibly outturn a Zero. Hellcats are iron cats, built like trucks. American pilots are safe because their planes are safe. The mockery is a kind of armor, words hammered into shape to protect something softer underneath, the creeping suspicion that the old balance is gone. A Japanese pilot, young enough to have missed the early victories, listens to an older man talk about 1941 and 1942 like legends, then looks at his own flight hours and says nothing. The older man doesn't say what he's thinking either. That the Americans now have more carriers, more aircraft, more trained pilots cycling through combat, and a rescue system that plucks downed men from the sea so they can fly again, while Japan's losses fall into the ocean and stay there. On Essex, Murphy hears the controller's voice sharpen. Bogies, bearing 270, range 150, Angels 1-5, multiple groups. The words hit the cockpit like ice water. You can't see anything yet, only the vast blank of sky, but you feel the fleet's posture shift. More fighters launched, deck crews moving faster, gunners checking arcs. The cap climbs, and as Murphy pushes the Hellcat upward, the engine's rumble deepens, the air thinning, the canopy frosting faintly at the edges. His wingman's silhouette holds tight off his left, and the two of them ride the invisible guidance of radar into a place where the sky will soon be full of dots, turning into aircraft, turning into people trying to kill each other. Far away, Japanese strike groups are lifting off too, their pilots staring at the horizon and telling themselves the Americans will panic, will turn too tight, will make the same mistakes they made 2 years ago. But Murphy has seen the new war. He has seen Hellcats refuse the turn, seen them dive away and climb back, seen them absorb hits and still come home. He has also seen how American doctrine now treats pilots like a resource worth preserving, not a match to be burned for honor. As the first faint specks appear, tiny, almost harmless, Murphy tightens his grip and feels the moment stretch, because he knows what's about to happen over the Philippine Sea isn't just a battle. It's a collision between two systems of air power, and one of those systems has learned how to turn heavy into deadly on an industrial scale. June 19th, 1944. Over the Philippine Sea, north of Saipan. The first wave doesn't arrive as airplanes, it arrives as numbers. Radar plots, bearings, ranges, voices on the fighter direction circuit slicing the morning into commands. And up on cap at Angels, high teens Eddie Murphy hears it all at once. Multiple bogey groups, closing fast. The controller's tone still controlled but tightened like a wire. Below, Task Force 58 steams in perfect lethal order under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, and above it the Hellcats are already climbing into position, Grumman wings flashing as sections stack in altitude bands the way they've practiced for months. Murphy spots the enemy as tiny black flecks far out, then the flecks resolve into a ragged, uneven stream. Japanese carrier aircraft pushing in from the west, Zeros and other fighters escorting dive bombers and torpedo planes, the whole formation stretched and loose as if the ocean wind has already begun to tear it apart. In that first long second of contact, you can feel the collision of eras. The Japanese pilots are flying with courage and tradition, expecting individual skill and tight turns to carry the day. The Americans are flying inside a system, already vectored into the enemy's path, already holding altitude and speed like a loaded spring. Murphy's section rolls in from above, sun behind them, and he hears his flight leader's voice. Flat, almost calm. Don't get slow. Hit and climb. Then the sky detonates into motion. Tracers arc, engine notes climb and dip, aircraft cross at closing speeds that make your eyes water. A Zero tries to hook into a turning fight, and Murphy refuses the invitation, shoving the nose down just enough to keep energy, rolling through a high-speed pass that brings the enemy across his gun sight for only a heartbeat. He squeezes the trigger, and the Hellcat's 6.50 hammer, steady and brutal, and the Zero shudders, a flash of debris, then drops away, trailing smoke. There's no time to watch it fall. Another target is already there. A Japanese torpedo bomber, lumbering in low, wings rocking as it tries to get through the wall of fighters, and Murphy dives, feeling the Hellcat accelerate like it's eager, the airframe solid under strain, and he rakes the bomber from behind. Fabric and metal shred, a brief orange bloom, and it plunges toward the sea. Around him, the CAP is doing the same thing in dozens of simultaneous decisions. Hellcat slashing through, climbing back, slashing again, while the Japanese strike grows more chaotic by the minute, pilots breaking formation to evade, escorts pulled away into dogfights, attack runs disrupted before they can even begin. Below, the American fleet's anti-aircraft guns open up in disciplined layers, but fewer attackers are reaching that final gauntlet, and that's the point. The battle is being decided out here, far from the ships, by radar vectors and cap doctrine, and fighters that can take a hit and keep flying. Over the radio, someone blurts a half laugh, half gasp. They're coming in like training targets. And Murphy hates the sound because men are dying down there. But he understands the grim truth. This isn't a duel between equals anymore. It's interception as process. Kill after kill stacking up while the Japanese air groups dissolve into scattered survivors, fleeing back toward a carrier deck they may never see again. The first morning wave is only the beginning, because carrier warfare doesn't give you a single climax. It gives you exhaustion in layers. After the initial intercepts on June 19th, Eddie Murphy returns to Essex with his fuel needle low and his throat dry, landing hard as the ship bucks, tailhooks slamming a wire, and the moment the Hellcat stops, deckhands swarm it. Refuel hose, ammo belts, quick inspections, faces expressionless because speed matters more than celebration. In the ready room, pilots gulp coffee and water, hands still shaking as they sketch quick debriefs on kneeboards, headings, altitudes, enemy types, where the torpedo bombers tried to run in, where the Zeros tried to hook them slow. The intelligence officer pins notes on a board that's filling with grim arithmetic, and the numbers climb fast enough to feel unreal. A lieutenant says quietly, "They just kept coming," and another answers, "Because they can't not come. Because everyone knows the Japanese carriers have to break the American hold near Saipan or lose the Marianas, and losing the Marianas means B-29s will soon be within reach of Japan itself." Back in the air, the cap cycles again, launch, climb, vector, each time trusting the radar screens and the controllers who are guiding them like unseen hands. Murphy hears that some Japanese aircraft are turning back not because they've changed their minds, but because they can't find the fleet. Navigation is breaking them as surely as gunfire, the vast oceans swallowing formations that would have been deadly over land. When the next contacts come, they're smaller groups, more scattered, and that scatter is a symptom of something worse. Japanese pilots are flying at the edge of their fuel envelopes, pushed out to maximum range, and many of them will not have the gas to go anywhere but toward the American fleet and then down, either shot down or forced to ditch. The sea below becomes a graveyard and a test of a different American advantage. Rescue. As Murphy dives on a low attacker, he glimpses a silver flare on the water, a downed US pilot signal, and far behind the fleet, a destroyer is already swinging out of formation, white wake curving, moving to pick him up. The knowledge that the Navy will try to retrieve you changes how you fight. It doesn't make you reckless, but it reduces the fatalistic edge that haunted 1942, when a parachute over water often meant death by time. The Japanese, by contrast, have no such comfort. A ditching is often the end, not just of the pilot, but of years of training Japan can't afford to replace, and you can feel that desperation in their attacks. Some coming in too low, too straight, holding the run because they believe only a clean torpedo drop can justify the fuel they burn to get here. Murphy watches one torpedo plane press through defensive fire anyway, smoke pouring from its engine, pilot refusing to pull off. It's courage, yes, but it's also a terrible kind of arithmetic. If you're not coming back, you might as well die trying. American gunners hammer it and it splashes short of the task force, the sea erupting, the threat neutralized without a ship being hit. In the afternoon, as the sky begins to clear of attackers, the fleet's tension doesn't release, it shifts. Now the problem is American pilots who chased enemies too far, who burned fuel in long climbs and dives and are returning low, scattered, some with damage. The flight deck becomes a controlled frenzy, planes stacking up in landing patterns, deck crews waving paddles, emergency barriers ready. And Murphy sees one Hellcat come in with its belly streaked black and its canopy cracked. It bounces, hook misses, and the pilot pours power on for a bolter, the aircraft shuddering as if it might come apart, then somehow climbs. When it lands on the next pass, men cheer once and then stop, because the next landing is already coming. Offshore, the sea continues to fill with parachutes and dinghies. Murphy watches, between sorties, as smoke pots mark a downed pilot's position and a destroyer darts out, and he realizes that today's slaughter is not just about the Hellcat's guns, it's about the whole American machine preserving its own, while the Japanese machine bleeds irreplaceables into the water. By evening, the phrase starts circulating, half stunned, half disbelieving. It was a turkey shoot. Some men laugh, some don't, because even as a joke, it's too close to truth. The Japanese air groups came in waves and were cut down in the open, many never reaching weapon release, many never making it back to a deck. Murphy sits on the hangar deck later, helmet in his lap, listening to the ship's ventilators hum and the distant clang of tools, and he thinks about the Japanese pilots who mocked the Hellcat as heavy, as clumsy. He thinks about how heaviness became armor, how speed became choice, and how choice, more than bravado, wins in modern air combat. June 20th, 1944. Late afternoon over open ocean, west of the Marianas. The day begins with a strange quiet that feels wrong after the previous day's storm of contacts, and by mid-afternoon the fleet's mood turns restless because the enemy carriers, Ozawa's mobile fleet, are out there somewhere, damaged in spirit and depleted in air crews, but still afloat, still capable of slipping away to fight another day. Then the message ripples through Task Force 58 like electricity. Scouts have found them at extreme range. In the ready rooms and on flight decks, you can feel the debate made real in decisions. Launch late, launch far, risk not getting your planes back, or let the enemy escape. Mitscher chooses the risk. The order goes out to launch a long-range strike near the edge of daylight, and suddenly the deck is alive again. Aircraft pushed into place with urgency, engines coughing into roar as if the fleet is trying to reach across the horizon with sheer will. Eddie Murphy straps in, checks his fuel, looks at the sun already dropping, and knows what this means. If they chase too far, the ocean will be waiting in darkness for whoever can't find the fleet on the way home. But the Hellcat is not just a killer today. It's escort and shepherd, tasked to protect bombers as they fly into the last light toward a distant target. The strike forms up in ragged layers, and Murphy watches the sun glare off wings and canopies, the sky turning gold and then copper, the ocean below a darkening plate. Far ahead, the Japanese carriers appear at last as faint shapes with white wakes, and the attack begins. American dive bombers and torpedo planes pushing in as the fleet's anti-aircraft fire reaches up like a bristling hedge. Murphy sees smoke rising from one carrier, then another, and for a moment victory feels like closure. Then the sun drops further, and closure becomes a new problem, getting home. The return flight is chaos spread across hundreds of miles. Planes are damaged, low on fuel, scattered by flak and maneuver, and the sky is dimming fast. Radios fill with strained voices, men asking for bearings, men calling their lost, men reporting fuel state critical, men trying to stay calm because panic burns what little oxygen you have left. Murphy's Hellcat is down to fumes, the engine still steady, but the gauge needle a threat. The ocean below is now nearly black, and the horizon is a bruise of fading light. Somewhere behind him, a bomber limps along, silhouette wobbling, and Murphy stays with it, because that's what you do, because sometimes the only way another crew lives is if a fighter shepherds them toward hope. Then, at last, the fleet's lights appear, small, unbelievable points in the darkness. And just as unbelievable, searchlights and landing signals are turned on. It's a decision that risks submarines, risks attack, but Mitscher orders it because the cost of darkness is too high. The carriers become floating beacons, and the sea around them becomes a rescue field for any pilot who has to ditch within reach. Murphy lines up in the landing pattern with dozens of other aircraft, engines sputtering, men sweating in the dark. And as he comes in, the deck seems to rise and fall like a living animal. He catches a wire by instinct and luck, and the moment his wheels stop rolling, he feels his body go slack, as if the adrenaline has been the only thing holding him upright. Around him, other planes miss, crash, slide. Some go over the side. Deck crews run toward burning wrecks without hesitation, fire hoses whipping, men dragging pilots out as the ship pitches. Off the stern, splashes mark ditchings, and destroyers dart like dogs into the night to pick up whoever they can. The victory over Japanese carrier air power is real, but the cost is not invisible. The ocean takes men even on the winning side, and the night smells of fuel and smoke and salt and fear. In the hangar deck afterward, Murphy sits among other pilots, faces lit by harsh work lights. And no one talks about mockery anymore. No one needs to. The Hellcat has proven itself not in a clean duel, but in the ugliest truth of naval air war. The ability to fight hard, survive damage, fly far, and still bring men back from the edge of the ocean. The Japanese air arm will never fully recover from what happened over these 2 days, and the Americans, even as they win, learn that modern victory can still demand a bill paid in darkness. The morning after the sunset chase feels unreal, like the fleet is waking up inside its own legend. On June 21st, 1944, Task Force 58 steams under a clean sky with the sea calm again, and that calm is the cruelest contrast of all, because the water around the formation is still marked by oil slicks, floating debris, and the occasional empty life raft. Mute evidence of how quickly men can vanish when night and distance get involved. Eddie Murphy walks the hangar deck and passes aircraft that look like they've aged a year in 2 days. Hellcats with patched holes, canopies replaced, wings scraped, Avengers and Helldivers with bent prop tips and scorched panels, mechanics already working with the single-minded focus of people who know the war hasn't paused just because one battle ended. In the ready room, the tally becomes official, in the way official things always feel too clean for what they represent. The Japanese have lost the bulk of their carrier air groups, hundreds of aircraft, and more important, many of the trained pilots and crewmen who made those aircraft dangerous. And the Americans, though not untouched, have preserved the core of their own air power. The phrase Great Marianas Turkey Shoot spreads beyond the flight decks now, carried in letters and jokes and press reports. But among pilots it has a darker edge. They know that what made it look easy was not luck, but the accumulation of hard lessons and industrial capacity. Radar direction that put fighters in the right place, a cap doctrine that refused low-speed traps, and an airplane that could take punishment and still bring a pilot home. Murphy hears one squadron commander say quietly that the enemy's biggest loss wasn't metal. It was time. Years of training poured into the sea in 2 days. And that is the kind of loss no emergency program can fix quickly. In Japanese circles, the mockery that once surrounded the Hellcat turns to bitterness and disbelief. Survivors who make it back to their decks report how the American fighters climbed above them like wolves on a ridge, how every attempt to turn tight was punished by diving slashes, how the Hellcat's speed in the dive and stability as a gun platform made short bursts lethal. Older pilots, those who fought Wildcats and Buffaloes early in the war, struggle to reconcile their memory of American fighters with what they just faced. The new American reality is that a fighter doesn't have to outturn you if it can outlive you, out-accelerate you in the dive, and be flown by pilots guided to intercept by radar rather than luck. The aftermath reaches beyond the immediate battle too. With Japanese carrier aviation crippled, the US can continue Saipan operations with far less fear of massed carrier strikes. The Marianas become a platform for B-29 operations, and the war's center of gravity shifts closer to Japan. Murphy is not thinking about grand strategy in the immediate days after, but he feels the weight of it anyway in small moments. Fewer frantic launch orders, fewer emergency calls, a sense that the enemy's reach has shortened. Yet there is also an emptiness. He attends a brief memorial on the flight deck. No grand ceremony, just names read, caps off, the wind pulling at uniforms. And he hears the ocean's steady hiss against the hull while the chaplain's words blur. Because the sea doesn't care about victory or defeat. It only takes what falls into it. Afterward, the squadron's talk becomes practical again. Training new pilots, reviewing gunnery film, refining tactics, because the Hellcat's triumph doesn't end the need for discipline. If anything, it raises the standard. The Hellcat is now the baseline expectation: durability, power, pilot survivability, and pilots are expected to fight smart, not just hard. Murphy sees a younger pilot, barely months in the fleet, listening to debriefs with wide eyes, and realizes that this is the real compounding advantage. American pilots now have time to become veterans, and veterans have time to teach, while Japan's system is bleeding experience faster than it can be grown. He thinks back to the early days when Japanese pilots mocked American fighters as heavy, as crude, as unworthy opponents. In 1944, that mockery is gone, replaced by a brutal recognition that the Hellcat is not just a plane, it is the embodiment of American naval war-making: industrial, disciplined, survivable, and guided by a technology of detection and control that turns open ocean into a managed battlefield. In the weeks that follow, Murphy flies more missions, strikes, CAP, escorts, and each time he watches the horizon, he feels the battle's aftershock. Fewer enemy aircraft, fewer coordinated attacks, fewer confident intercepts. The Turkey Shoot wasn't a single day of luck. It was the moment a whole air arm broke, and the Hellcat was the claw that helped snap it. Autumn 1944. Western Pacific, aboard USS Essex. The war doesn't slow down just because one enemy capability collapses. It simply shifts, like a fire moving to new fuel. And Eddie Murphy feels that shift in the weeks after the Philippine Sea as the carrier air groups push westward. More strikes, more escorts, more combat air patrols overseas that look the same until you notice how the threats have changed. Japanese carrier aviation, once the sharp edge of their maritime power, is now a diminished thing. The enemy still fights, ferociously, often desperately, but the coordinated, veteran-driven carrier strike machine that had terrified the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 has been broken, and the Hellcat has become a symbol of that break in a way pilots rarely admit aloud. Murphy walks the hangar deck and sees rows of F6Fs with maintenance panels open, mechanics working like surgeons, and he realizes the aircraft's greatest contribution may be the most unromantic. It keeps American pilots alive long enough to keep flying. It forgives small errors. It absorbs flak and still returns. It lets a pilot choose speed and altitude over pride. In combat, that translates into a different kind of confidence: quiet, procedural, repeatable. Remembering the Japanese mockery now almost feels like remembering a rumor from another lifetime. He hears it only occasionally, filtered through intelligence reports and captured documents, phrases about fat cats, jokes about heavy American fighters, and each time it comes up, it sounds less like arrogance and more like the kind of gallows humor men use when the sky is no longer theirs. On one mission near the Philippines, Murphy escorts strike aircraft through scattered opposition. He sees Japanese fighters appear in ones and twos, not in disciplined waves, and he can almost read the shortage behind it. Fewer trained pilots, fewer serviceable aircraft, fewer carriers capable of launching massed strikes. A young Japanese pilot tries to pull him into a turning contest anyway. Instinct overriding doctrine, and Murphy doesn't indulge him. He slashes through, a short burst, then climbs away, leaving the enemy spiraling in thin air that offers no advantage anymore. The Hellcat's verdict isn't spoken, it's enforced by physics and training and the relentless American ability to put new airplanes and new pilots onto deck after deck. Later, Murphy sits at a small mess table and writes a letter home, trying to explain what the Philippine Sea felt like without sounding like he's bragging about slaughter. He writes about radar vectors that put them exactly where the enemy would be, about the way the sky filled with contacts, about the strange mixture of terror and routine that comes when you're fighting inside a system. He doesn't write the phrase Turkey Shoot. He writes instead about seeing downed pilots rescued, about the fleet turning on its lights at night to bring men home, about the cost that never makes it into headlines. He thinks of the Japanese pilots too, some veterans, some barely trained, who flew into a trap built from range, detection, and disciplined interception, and he knows that the war's brutal irony is that courage is not enough when the enemy's machine has outgrown yours. In the months after, as operations press toward Leyte and beyond, the Hellcat continues to serve as the fleet's shield, but now it faces a new kind of threat: kamikaze attacks, where the enemy's goal is not to survive the fight at all. Even then, the Hellcat's qualities matter: speed to intercept, ruggedness to endure near misses, firepower to break up attackers before they reach ships packed with men. Murphy watches one diving aircraft explode under 50 caliber fire and feels no satisfaction, only a numb recognition that the enemy has shifted from tactics to sacrifice because the old tactics died over the Philippine Sea. By the time Murphy leaves the flight deck and climbs down into the carrier's passageways at the end of a long day, the air is thick with exhaust and sweat, and the metallic taste of the ship's ventilation, and he understands the arc of the story in a way no official communique can convey. The Hellcat wasn't mocked into greatness. It was built for the real conditions of naval war: rough decks, long ranges, poor visibility, flak, exhaustion, and the constant need to bring pilots home. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was the moment the world saw what the airplane and the American carrier system had become together: a disciplined, radar-guided, survivable air power that could shred an opponent's elite in a single decisive encounter. In the Pacific sky, mockery doesn't die in argument. It dies in silence. When the enemy stops coming in the numbers he once could, and the ocean's vast blue turns from contested space into a runway for American victory.